I'm 71 years old now, and for 53 years, I've kept secrets that could rewrite everything we think we know about what lives in America's forests. My name is Robert Chen, and from 1971 until I retired in 2004, I worked as a field investigator for a division of the U.S. government that officially doesn't exist. We had no name, no building with our agency listed, no public budget. We answered to a deputy director at the Department of the Interior who reported directly to someone in the Pentagon. Our job was simple in theory but devastating in practice. We investigated, documented, and covered up encounters between humans and creatures the government has known about since at least the early 1960s. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the forest people, whatever you want to call them, they're real. And what I'm about to tell you about 7 specific cases, 7 incidents the government buried so deep that most of the files have been destroyed, will explain why they've worked so hard to keep this secret. Let me start at the beginning because you need to understand how I got pulled into this world. It was August 1971. I was 28 years old, fresh out of graduate school with a degree in wildlife biology from UC Davis. I'd accepted what I thought was a straightforward position with the National Park Service, working as a field researcher, studying black bear populations in Olympic National Park in Washington State. The pay was decent, the work was outdoors, and I'd be contributing to conservation efforts. It seemed perfect. My first day, I reported to a ranger station near Port Angeles. The head ranger, a weathered man in his 50s named Bill Kowalski, looked at my paperwork with an odd expression. He made a phone call, spoke in low tones I couldn't quite hear, then hung up and told me to wait. An hour later, a man in a plain gray suit arrived in an unmarked sedan. He introduced himself only as Mr. Graves. No first name, no agency identification, just Mr. Graves. He drove me 3 hours south to a location I was forbidden from discussing, a facility that looked from the outside like a regular Park Service maintenance depot. Inside, it was something else entirely. Computer terminals that looked advanced even for 1971, filing cabinets with combination locks, a map room where the walls were covered with topographical maps of the western United States marked with dozens of colored pins. Mr. Graves led me to a small conference room where 2 other people waited. A woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Whitmore, a primatologist from Stanford, and a gruff-looking man in his 60s wearing a U.S. Army uniform with no insignia. The Army man never gave his name, just sat there watching me with eyes that had clearly seen things that changed him. Mr. Graves opened a folder and slid several photographs across the table. The first one showed a massive footprint in mud, clearly defined, with 5 toes and a structure that looked almost human but was far too large. 17 inches long, according to the measurement ruler placed beside it. The second photo showed a dark, hair-covered arm reaching around a tree trunk. The third photo made my breath catch. It was a full-body shot of a creature, taken from perhaps 50 yards away with a telephoto lens. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, with a conical head and shoulders so broad they looked almost inhuman. The proportions were wrong for any bear, wrong for any known primate. "Mr. Chen," Mr. Graves said quietly, "you signed several security clearances when you accepted your position. Those weren't for studying bears. We need to know right now if you can handle what we're about to tell you, because once you're in, there's no walking away from this." I looked at those photographs, my scientific training warring with the evidence in front of my eyes. "What is it?" "A species of great ape, previously unknown to science," Dr. Whitmore said. "Native to North America, probably numbering in the low hundreds at most. Scattered across the Pacific Northwest, the Cascade Range, parts of the Rockies, and a few isolated populations in the Appalachians. They're highly intelligent, primarily nocturnal, and have learned to avoid human contact with remarkable effectiveness." "How long have you known?" I asked. "Definitively since 1963, Mr. Graves replied. "We had strong suspicions before that, based on indigenous accounts and scattered reports from trappers and loggers going back to the 1800s. But in June of 1963, something happened that forced the government to take this seriously. That's where your first story begins, because that incident became the foundation for everything that followed. The template for how we would handle every encounter from that point forward." The nameless army man finally spoke, his voice rough like gravel. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at a level above top secret. 19 people know the complete truth about what happened. You're about to become the 20th. In June of 1963, the man continued. A construction crew was building a Forest Service road in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, about 40 miles northeast of Portland, Oregon. 12 men, heavy equipment, a project that was supposed to take 3 months. They'd been working for 2 weeks when things started going wrong. Equipment failures, unexplained damage to their machinery overnight, tools going missing. The crew boss, a man named Frank Holloway, initially thought it was vandalism or maybe a competitor trying to sabotage the project. Then came the night of June 14th. The crew had set up a temporary camp about a mile from the road they were building. Frank and 2 other men, Pete Martinez and a kid named Danny Reeves, were sleeping in tents while the rest of the crew had gone into town for the weekend. Around 2 in the morning, Danny woke to a sound he later described as something between a scream and a roar, not like any animal he'd ever heard. He unzipped his tent and stepped outside into the moonlight. That's when he saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 20 yards away, was something massive and upright. It stood completely still, just watching the camp. Danny froze. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. He told investigators later that he felt like prey being evaluated by a predator. Then the creature moved closer. It walked on 2 legs with a gait that was almost human, but not quite. The shoulders swayed differently. The arms hung lower. When it got within 10 yards of Danny's tent, he finally found his voice and screamed. That woke Frank and Pete. Frank came out of his tent carrying a hunting rifle, a .30-06 he always kept nearby. Pete had a flashlight. They both saw the creature clearly. Pete's flashlight beam hit it full on, and they got a perfect view. 8 feet tall minimum, Frank told investigators, maybe closer to 9, covered in dark brown hair, matted and thick. The face, Jesus, the face was almost human. A huge brow ridge, deep-set eyes that reflected the flashlight like an animal's, but with an intelligence behind them. It looked right at us, and I knew it was thinking, evaluating what to do. Frank raised his rifle. The creature saw the motion and made a sound, a low rumbling that Pete described as sounding like a warning. "Don't!" Pete yelled at Frank. "Don't shoot it! We don't know what it'll do!" Frank lowered the rifle slightly, and the 3 men just stood there in a standoff, with this impossible thing for what felt like hours but was probably less than a minute. Then the creature turned and walked away. Not running, just walking calmly back into the forest. They could hear it moving through the underbrush, heavy footfalls that shook the ground, and then silence. The 3 men didn't sleep the rest of that night. They sat by their truck with the headlights on, Frank holding his rifle, waiting for dawn. At first light, they followed the creature's trail. The footprints were clear in the soft earth, enormous impressions that showed every detail. They followed the trail for about a quarter mile until it led to something that changed everything. A cave entrance partially hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss and vines. The opening was maybe 5 feet high and 4 feet wide. Pete shined his flashlight inside, and what they saw made them back away immediately. The cave wasn't empty. There were more of them. At least 3, maybe 4 creatures sleeping or resting in the darkness. One of them, smaller than the others, was clearly a juvenile. They'd found a family group, a den site. Frank, Pete and Danny retreated back to camp and immediately drove to the nearest ranger station. They reported what they'd seen, expecting to be laughed at or dismissed. Instead, the ranger made a call that got transferred 3 times, and within 6 hours, the area was swarmed with federal agents. Not FBI, not wildlife services, but men in military uniforms who arrived in unmarked vehicles. The construction site was shut down immediately. The entire crew was brought in for questioning separately. Each man was told that what they'd reported was actually a bear sighting, that they'd been mistaken in the poor light, and their fear had caused them to misidentify a common black bear as something else. They were offered a choice: accept this explanation, sign non-disclosure agreements, and receive a payment of $10,000 each, a significant sum in 1963, or refuse and face federal charges related to national security violations. Every member of the crew took the money and signed the papers. Everyone except Danny Reeves. Danny was 22 years old, idealistic, and he refused to lie about what he'd seen. He said he'd tell the truth if anyone asked him. He was arrested that same day. The charges were fabricated, something about stolen government property from the construction site. He was held in a federal facility for 3 months. No trial, no lawyer, just detained. When he was finally released, he was a different person. Whatever happened to him during those 3 months broke something inside him. He never spoke about the incident again. He never spoke much about anything again. He moved to California, worked low-level jobs, died of a heart attack in 1987, alone in a studio apartment. But the government's response didn't stop with silencing the crew. A team was sent to the cave site, the team Dr. Whitmore and Mr. Graves were part of, actually. They arrived with tranquilizer guns, nets, and a plan to capture at least one of the creatures for study. What they found instead was an empty cave. The creatures were gone. They'd abandoned the site completely, leaving behind only some nesting materials, branches, and moss arranged into sleeping platforms and footprints leading deeper into the forest. The team tracked the creatures for 3 days but never caught up to them. It was like the creatures knew they were being followed and stayed just ahead of the pursuit. The operation was called off, but the cave site itself provided invaluable evidence. The nesting materials, the footprints, samples of hair caught on tree bark, and something else. Drawings, crude pictographs scratched into the cave walls with charcoal or burned wood. The images showed family groups, creatures that looked like the Sasquatch, adults and juveniles together. There were also drawings that appeared to depict hunting scenes, showing the creatures catching fish and gathering plants. Tool use, social structure, and artistic expression. These weren't just animals. That's when the decision was made at the highest levels. The creatures existed, they were intelligent, and they needed to be kept secret. The reasoning was straightforward. If the public knew that a large, intelligent primate was living in American forests, there would be mass panic, hunting parties, people flooding into the wilderness trying to capture or kill them. The creatures would likely be driven to extinction within a generation. Additionally, there were legal complications. If these creatures were proven to be real and classified as endangered, huge portions of national forests would need to be designated as protected habitat, which would interfere with logging, mining, development, billions of dollars in economic interests. So the cover-up began. The 1963 incident became the blueprint. Any future encounters would be investigated by a small, secret team. Evidence would be suppressed, witnesses would be paid off or discredited, and the official position would remain. Bigfoot doesn't exist. It's a myth, a legend, a misidentification of known animals. Mr. Graves looked at me across that conference room table. That's what we do, Mr. Chen. We investigate reports of Sasquatch encounters. We document the truth, and then we bury it. We do it to protect these creatures from extinction, and we do it to prevent mass hysteria. We need someone with your scientific background to properly document and understand what we're finding. The pay is triple what the Park Service offered you, but you'll never be able to talk about your real work. You'll tell everyone you study bears, and that's what your official records will show. But your actual job will be tracking and documenting an intelligent species that we're pretending doesn't exist. I should have walked away. I should have refused. But I was 28 years old. I'd just seen photographic evidence of something incredible, and the scientist in me couldn't resist. I agreed. I signed more papers than I could count, accepted a salary that was deposited into my bank account from a Department of the Interior budget line that technically didn't exist, and began the strangest career anyone could imagine. Over the next 33 years, I would investigate 67 reported encounters between humans and Sasquatch across 7 western states. 67 cases where we found clear evidence that something happened, something real. Most of those cases were routine, if anything about this work could be called routine. A hiker sees something at a distance, we interview them, find some tracks or physical evidence, pay them to stay quiet, and file the report. But 7 cases, 7 specific incidents, were different. 7 times I encountered situations that were so significant, so disturbing, or so revealing that they fundamentally changed how I understood these creatures and why the government was so determined to hide them. Let me tell you about those 7 cases. Case number 2 on my list occurred in September of 1976 in the Cascade Mountains of Northern California. I'd been doing this work for 5 years by then, and I thought I understood the patterns. Sasquatch were shy, avoided humans, occasionally got spotted at a distance, but never allowed close contact. That belief shattered on the morning of September 23rd. I received a call from Mr. Graves, which was unusual. Normally, I got my assignments through coded messages left at a P.O. box in Portland. A phone call meant urgency, meant something significant had happened. There's been an incident, he said without preamble. Multiple witnesses, potential physical evidence, and one of the witnesses is a county sheriff. We need you in Redding, California, within 6 hours. I drove through the night, arriving in Redding just after dawn. I was directed to a motel on the outskirts of town where I met with 3 people. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and troubled eyes. A young woman named Lisa Crawford who looked like she'd been crying recently. And Dr. Whitmore, who'd flown in from Stanford. What happened started 3 days ago, Sheriff Bradley began. Lisa here works for the Forest Service doing trail maintenance in the Trinity Alps wilderness. She was working alone on a remote section of trail when she saw something. Lisa's hands were shaking as she spoke. I was clearing brush about 15 miles from the nearest trailhead. It was around 3 in the afternoon, good visibility, clear weather. I heard something moving through the trees, something big. At first I thought it was a bear, but then it stepped into view about 30 yards away. It was standing upright, at least 7 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair. It just stood there watching me. I froze. I didn't know what to do. We looked at each other for maybe 20 seconds, and then it did something I didn't expect. It picked up a stick from the ground and threw it. Not at me, but off to my left, almost like it was trying to get me to look that way, to distract me. I looked where the stick went, and when I looked back, it was gone. Lisa reported the incident to her supervisor, who dismissed it as a bear sighting. But Lisa was insistent. She knew what she'd seen. The supervisor filed a report anyway. Standard procedure for any unusual wildlife encounter, and that report made its way through channels until it reached someone who understood what it really meant. 2 days later, Sheriff Bradley got a call from a local named James Holcomb. James owned property that bordered the national forest, about 5 miles from where Lisa had her encounter. James reported that something had been coming onto his property at night. He'd lost chickens from his coop, found his garbage scattered, and heard strange vocalizations in the woods behind his house. Loud, whooping sounds that he'd never heard before. Last night, James continued through the sheriff. He decided to stay up and keep watch. Around midnight, he saw a figure moving near his chicken coop, something large and dark. He grabbed his shotgun and a powerful flashlight and went outside. When he shined the light at the figure, he got a clear view. "It was one of them," he told me, Sheriff Bradley said. "A Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. It was trying to get into his chicken coop. When the light hit it, the creature turned and looked right at James. He said it was the most unsettling thing he'd ever experienced. The intelligence in those eyes, the way it evaluated him, decided he wasn't a threat, and then calmly walked away into the woods." James fired his shotgun into the air, not at the creature, but as a warning. The creature didn't run, just kept walking at the same pace until it disappeared into the trees. The problem was what James found the next morning. "Blood," Sheriff Bradley said. "Fresh blood on the fence around his chicken coop, and a trail of it leading into the forest. The creature had cut itself, probably on the chicken wire when it was trying to get in." James followed the blood trail for about 100 yards before it disappeared, but he found something else. Footprints, clear as day in the soft earth. He called me immediately. That's when I called your people. Dr. Whitmore and I exchanged glances. Blood meant DNA, meant potential proof, meant evidence that could be catastrophic if it fell into the wrong hands. "We need to collect that evidence immediately," I said. "And we need to find out if the creature is injured. If it left a blood trail, it might be hurt badly enough that it's still in the area." The four of us drove out to James Holcomb's property, a small ranch with a house, a barn, and various outbuildings surrounded by dense forest. James, a man in his 60s with the lean build of someone who'd worked outdoors his whole life, showed us the chicken coop. The blood was still visible on the chain-link fence, dark and dried, but clearly recent. Using sterile collection techniques that Dr. Whitmore had taught me, I carefully scraped samples of the blood into sealed containers. We photographed the fence, the surrounding area, and the footprints James had found. The prints were extraordinary, 17 inches long with clear toe impressions, nail marks, even the texture of skin visible in the finest details. Dr. Whitmore took plaster casts while I documented the stride length and depth, calculating that whatever made these prints weighed at least 600 pounds. Then we followed the blood trail. It led us into the forest, disappearing and reappearing on rocks and low branches where the creature must have brushed against them. We tracked it for about a quarter mile, moving slowly and carefully. Sheriff Bradley had brought his service weapon. I had pepper spray, though I doubted it would be effective against something that large. The trail led to a small ravine with a creek at the bottom, and there, lying on a flat rock near the water, we found something that made us all stop short. It was a makeshift bandage, not a natural occurrence, not something that could be explained away. Someone had deliberately created a bandage using large leaves, broad maple leaves I later identified, and strips of inner bark woven together to hold them in place. The leaves were pressed against the rock, and when I carefully lifted them, I found more blood underneath, fresh blood, and what looked like deliberate pressure application. The creature had treated its own wound. Dr. Whitmore knelt beside the rock, examining the bandage with professional fascination. "This demonstrates advanced cognitive ability," she said quietly. "Problem-solving, tool use, understanding of basic medical principles like pressure to stop bleeding and covering a wound to keep it clean. This is behavior we'd associate with human-level intelligence, not animal instinct." We documented everything, photographing the bandage from multiple angles, collecting additional blood samples. Sheriff Bradley stood watch, his hand never far from his weapon, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest. "If it's this intelligent," he said, "then it knows we're here. It knows we're following it. Should we be doing this?" That was the question, wasn't it? Were we putting ourselves at risk? Or were we risking something worse? Were we intruding on a creature that simply wanted to be left alone? A creature that had bandaged its own wound and was hiding somewhere nearby, probably watching us, probably terrified. I made the decision to back off. We'd collected enough evidence. Pushing further could provoke a confrontation that wouldn't end well for anyone. We returned to James Holcomb's ranch and then to the motel in Redding. That night, Dr. Whitmore and I sent the blood samples to a private lab we used, a facility that processed sensitive materials with no questions asked. The results came back 3 days later and changed everything. The DNA was unique as we expected. It showed markers consistent with primate biology, but with sequences that didn't match any known species. Most significantly, the analysis indicated a genetic relationship to humans, closer than chimpanzees, closer than bonobos, somewhere between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals in terms of evolutionary distance. These creatures weren't just intelligent apes living in our forests. They were our cousins, a parallel branch of the human family tree that had somehow survived when every other human species went extinct. That finding was immediately classified above top secret. The samples were destroyed. The lab technician who processed them was visited by federal agents and paid a significant sum to forget he'd ever seen them. The official report I filed stated that the blood samples were from a black bear with an unusual genetic mutation, and the incident was closed. But I couldn't forget what we'd found. Neither could Dr. Whitmore. We'd proven, at least to ourselves and to the small group that knew the truth, that Sasquatch weren't just animals. They were people, different from us, adapted to a different way of life, but people nonetheless with intelligence, with culture, with the capacity to solve problems and care for their own injuries. That realization made everything harder. Every future encounter became more morally complicated because we weren't just covering up evidence of an unknown species. We were covering up evidence of another form of human being, and we were doing it to protect economic interests and prevent panic. Lisa Crawford and James Holcomb were paid for their silence, $40,000 each, and an agreement to never discuss what they'd seen. Sheriff Bradley, as a law enforcement officer, couldn't be bought off the same way, but he was read into a classified program that explained the larger picture. He understood why the secrecy was necessary and maintained it until his death from cancer in 1993. As for the injured Sasquatch, we never found it again. We monitored the area for weeks, looking for any sign of it, but the creature had vanished. I like to think it recovered, that it healed and rejoined its family group wherever they were hiding in those vast forests. But I don't know for certain. That case taught me something crucial about these creatures. They weren't just physically formidable. They were smart enough to understand medicine, smart enough to avoid us when they wanted to, and smart enough to know when they were being hunted. And that knowledge made them far more dangerous to the government's cover-up than any physical evidence could be. The third case I need to tell you about happened in October of 1982, deep in the mountains of Montana near the Canadian border. This one still haunts me because it involved children, and it revealed something about Sasquatch behavior that made the government's position even more complicated. I received an urgent call on October 16th from Mr. Graves. A situation had developed at a remote hunting lodge in the Kootenai National Forest. A family had gone missing during a guided hunting trip, and the initial search and rescue operation had found something the local authorities couldn't explain. I flew into Kalispell and drove 3 hours north to the lodge, a rustic compound of cabins owned by a man named Carl Preston. Carl had been running guided hunts in these mountains for 20 years, knew the terrain better than almost anyone, and he was visibly shaken when I arrived. Mr. Graves was already there, along with two men I didn't recognize, both wearing military fatigues with no insignia. The missing family was named Sullivan, Carl explained. Mark and Jennifer Sullivan, both in their 30s, and their two kids, a boy named Tyler, who was 9, and a girl named Emma, who was 7. They'd booked a week-long elk hunting trip. Mark was an experienced hunter, Jennifer was less experienced but capable, and the kids were just along for the family adventure, weren't actually hunting. On October 14th, the Sullivans had hiked out to a remote valley about 8 miles from the lodge. Carl had given them good directions, radios, and emergency supplies. They were supposed to check in twice daily. When they missed their evening check-in on the 14th, Carl wasn't too concerned. Radio signals could be spotty in some valleys, but when they missed their morning check-in on the 15th and their evening check-in again, he got worried. He hiked out to their planned campsite on the morning of the 16th and found their camp abandoned. The tent was still standing, their gear was inside, their food was hanging properly in a bear bag, but the family was gone. No signs of struggle, no blood, nothing obviously wrong except they weren't there. Carl immediately called for search and rescue. A team of 12 experienced searchers had been combing the area for 18 hours before I arrived, and they'd found something that made them call in federal authorities. One of the searchers, a woman named Beth Morris, showed me what they'd discovered about half a mile from the Sullivan campsite. It was a series of footprints, massive barefoot prints heading away from the camp and into the deep forest. The prints were accompanied by smaller prints, clearly human, clearly from children based on the size and stride. The children's prints showed signs of being made by shoes, tennis shoes based on the tread pattern. Tyler and Emma's prints were visible in the soft earth, and they were following the larger prints. Not being dragged, not running, just walking normally like they were following someone. Dr. Whitmore had arrived by helicopter an hour before me, and she was documenting the prints with her usual scientific precision. The children went willingly, she said, looking up at me with troubled eyes. There's no indication of force, no signs that they were frightened or trying to escape. They just walked away from camp following something that left these prints. We tracked the trail for 3 miles, a full search and rescue team, plus myself, Dr. Whitmore, Mr. Graves, and the 2 military men. The trail led us through increasingly difficult terrain, up steep slopes and through dense undergrowth that would have been challenging for small children. Yet the prints showed they'd navigated it successfully, still following the larger footprints. Then we found the first piece of evidence that this wasn't a typical missing persons case. Hanging from a low branch about 8 feet off the ground was Tyler's jacket, a bright red windbreaker that his parents had confirmed he'd been wearing. It was carefully placed, not torn or damaged, hung deliberately over the branch like someone had put it there intentionally. Why would they take off their jackets in this cold? One of the search and rescue members asked. It was October in Montana, temperatures in the 40s during the day, dropping below freezing at night. 100 yards further, we found Emma's jacket as well, a purple fleece also carefully placed on a branch. The deliberate placement suggested the children hadn't lost the jackets or discarded them. Someone or something had hung them where they'd be easily visible to anyone following the trail. It's marking the path, Dr. Whitmore said, like breadcrumbs, showing us the direction they went. But why? The trail continued for another mile before we reached a rocky outcropping with a large overhang that created a natural shelter. And there, sitting calmly on a flat rock, were Tyler and Emma Sullivan, alive and unharmed. They were huddled together under a pile of pine boughs that had clearly been placed over them intentionally for warmth. When they saw us approaching, Tyler stood up and waved. Emma started crying, whether from relief or delayed fear, it was hard to tell. We rushed forward. The medic on the search team immediately began checking them for injuries while the rest of us secured the area. The children were cold, hungry, and exhausted, but physically they were fine. No injuries, no signs of harm. Mr. Graves knelt down to Tyler's eye level. "Tyler, can you tell me what happened? Where are your parents?" Tyler's eyes were wide, but he spoke clearly. "The big man took us here. He said our parents were hurt and he was bringing us somewhere safe. He said people were coming to find us and we needed to wait here. He kept us warm. He brought us water. He said not to be scared." "Big man?" Mr. Graves pressed. "Can you describe him?" Tyler looked at Emma, who nodded encouragement. "He was really tall," Tyler said, "like 8 or 9 feet maybe. And he had hair all over, brown hair, kind of reddish. His face was different, kind of like a gorilla, but not exactly. He could talk, but it was hard to understand him. His voice was deep and the words were weird, but he was nice. He wasn't scary after the first minute." My stomach dropped. Emma spoke up, her voice small. "He found us after Mommy and Daddy didn't wake up. We tried to wake them, but they wouldn't get up, and we got scared. Then he came. He looked at Mommy and Daddy for a long time, and then he took our hands and said he'd take us somewhere safe until help came. He led us here and made us this bed and told us to stay warm. The implications were clear and devastating. Mark and Jennifer Sullivan were likely dead, and somehow a Sasquatch had found their children, recognized they were in danger, and led them to safety. We had to find the parents. Mr. Graves ordered Tyler and Emma to be taken back to the lodge immediately. The 2 military men escorted them while the rest of us continued searching. We backtracked along the trail, looking for any sign of where the children might have originally separated from their parents. We found Mark and Jennifer Sullivan 3 hours later, about a quarter-mile from their original campsite, in a direction the children couldn't have seen from the camp. They were both dead, lying side by side on the forest floor. The medical examiner who hiked in later that evening determined they'd died from carbon monoxide poisoning. They'd used a portable propane heater inside their tent, and the ventilation had been inadequate. They'd gone to sleep and never woken up, poisoned by the odorless gas. The children had been sleeping in a separate small tent, which had saved their lives. When they woke up in the morning and couldn't rouse their parents, they'd panicked and wandered away from camp. That's when the Sasquatch must have found them. The creature had somehow understood the situation, recognized that 2 small humans were in distress and danger, and made the decision to help them. It had led them miles through difficult terrain to a safe location, kept them warm, and hung their jackets along the route to guide rescuers. Then it had disappeared before we arrived. This wasn't animal behavior. This was compassion, moral reasoning, an understanding of human family bonds and the vulnerability of children. Dr. Whitmore and I spent hours that night in a cabin at the lodge, analyzing what had happened. We had 2 dead parents, 2 living children, and clear evidence of a Sasquatch intervening to save human lives. The creature could have ignored the children, could have seen them as a threat or a nuisance. Instead, it had protected them. The next morning, Mr. Graves brought Tyler and Emma in to speak with us again. The children had been cleaned up, fed, and had slept in real beds. They looked better, but still traumatized. With their aunt present, a woman who'd driven through the night from Billings to take custody of them, we asked more questions. "Tyler," I said gently, "did the big man tell you his name?" Tyler shook his head. He didn't really talk much, mostly just sounds and some words we could understand. But Emma called him the Forest Man, and he seemed to like that. "What did he tell you?" I asked. "That help was coming?" Tyler nodded. He said people with loud birds would come find us. I think he meant helicopters because we could hear them yesterday. He said he had to go before they arrived, that people would be scared of him and might hurt him. He made us promise not to tell anyone about him, but I guess we're telling you now. "You're doing the right thing by telling us," Mr. Graves assured him. Did the forest man seem worried about anything? Did he seem scared? Emma spoke up quietly. He kept looking at the sky, like he was watching for something, and he'd stop and listen a lot, like he was making sure nothing bad was coming. He seemed sad when he looked at our mommy and daddy, like he understood they were gone. The children were eventually released to their aunt, with a cover story carefully crafted by Mr. Graves. Their parents had died from carbon monoxide poisoning, a tragic accident. The children had wandered from camp in confusion and fear, and search and rescue had found them in the natural shelter where they'd taken refuge. No mention of anyone helping them. Tyler and Emma were young enough that with time and subtle suggestion, their memories could be reshaped. They'd eventually come to believe they'd found that shelter themselves, that the forest man was just a dream or a confused memory created by trauma. But Dr. Whitmore and I knew the truth. We had the footprints, dozens of clear impressions that we'd photographed and documented. We had the deliberately placed jackets. We had the bed of pine boughs arranged with care. And we had the testimony of 2 children who described in perfect detail a creature matching every characteristic of a Sasquatch who had saved their lives. The government's response was immediate and comprehensive. The Sullivan family was paid a wrongful death settlement, far exceeding what they should have received for an accident. The settlement came with NDAs for everyone involved. The search and rescue team members were debriefed separately and told that the story of mysterious footprints was a misidentification of bear tracks, that the children had simply been confused and traumatized. Most of them accepted this explanation. A few remained skeptical but were bound by additional agreements. Carl Preston, the lodge owner, received enough money to retire comfortably. The 2 military men disappeared, and I never saw them again. The photographs and plaster casts we'd made were filed away in storage facilities that technically didn't exist, and the official report concluded that Mark and Jennifer Sullivan died from accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. Their children survived by their own resilience, and there was nothing unusual about the incident beyond its tragic nature. But I kept my own notes, hidden records that documented the truth. A Sasquatch had saved 2 human children, had shown compassion and moral reasoning that many humans would struggle to demonstrate. These creatures weren't just intelligent, they had empathy, understanding, humanity in ways that transcended species. That case changed my perspective fundamentally. I'd started this work thinking I was studying an unknown primate species. After the Montana incident, I understood I was documenting a people, a society, a culture that existed parallel to our own. And the government was determined to keep that truth buried because acknowledging it would raise questions too complicated to answer. If Sasquatch were people, did they have rights? Did they deserve protection not as endangered animals but as indigenous inhabitants of these lands? Did disturbing their habitat constitute a violation of their sovereignty? These weren't questions the government wanted to confront. The 4th case came in March of 1987 in the Cascade Range of Washington State. This one involved a logger named Derek Thompson, who'd been working alone on a small private timber claim his family owned. Derek had been cutting trees on a hillside when his chainsaw blade caught on something, kicked back violently and sliced deep into his left thigh, severing the femoral artery. He'd dropped the chainsaw, applied pressure to the wound with his shirt, but he was losing blood fast. His truck was a quarter-mile away. He had no radio. He was alone, and he knew he was dying. Derek later told me that he'd started crawling toward his truck, leaving a trail of blood, but only made it about 50 yards before he collapsed from blood loss. He was going into shock, his vision tunneling, when he heard something approaching through the trees. Heavy footfalls, the sound of large branches being pushed aside. He thought it was a bear coming to finish him off, and he was too weak to care. Instead, what emerged from the forest was a Sasquatch, a large male, probably 8.5 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair. The creature approached Derek cautiously, made a low sound, then knelt beside him. Derek was barely conscious at this point, his memory foggy, but he clearly remembered the creature examining his wound. Then the Sasquatch did something extraordinary. It reached down, tore a large strip of bark from a nearby cedar tree, placed it directly over the wound, and pressed down with enormous hands, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. The creature held that pressure for what Derek estimated was at least 10 minutes, never moving, just maintaining steady pressure while making occasional soft vocalizations that sounded almost soothing. Then the Sasquatch carefully lifted Derek in its arms, cradling him like a child despite Derek weighing over 200 pounds, and began carrying him through the forest. Derek passed out at some point during the transport. When he woke up, he was lying beside his truck. The cedar bark was still pressed against his wound, held in place by strips of vine that had been wrapped around his leg like a bandage. The Sasquatch was gone. Derek managed to drag himself into his truck, drive to the nearest ranger station, and was evacuated by helicopter to a hospital in Seattle. The wound required extensive surgery, multiple transfusions, and a week in intensive care. He should have died from blood loss in that forest. The doctors told him that someone must have applied pressure to the wound almost immediately, that the cedar bark bandage had been crude but effective, and that without that intervention he'd have been dead in minutes. Derek told the doctors and anyone who'd listen what really happened, that a Bigfoot had saved his life, had administered first aid and carried him to safety. Most people assumed he was delirious from blood loss, that he'd hallucinated or confused a good Samaritan hiker for something else. But Derek's story reached the right channels, and I was dispatched to investigate 2 weeks later when he was released from the hospital. I met Derek at his home outside of Seattle. He was recovering well, walking with crutches, and he was adamant about what he'd experienced. "I know how it sounds, Mr. Chen," he told me, "but I know what I saw. I looked into that creature's eyes. There was intelligence there, understanding. It knew I was hurt, and it knew how to help me. It saved my life." I asked him to take me to the site where the incident occurred. Derek's leg wasn't healed enough for him to make the trip, but he gave me detailed directions and marked the location on a topographical map. I hiked out to the timber claim with Dr. Whitmore and a tracking specialist named Michael Torres, who'd recently been brought onto our team. We found the site exactly where Derek described. There was still blood on the ground, dried dark stains on the moss and leaves. We found the spot where Derek had collapsed, found the deep gouges in the earth where the Sasquatch had knelt beside him, and we found something else that confirmed Derek's entire story. Footprints, massive prints in the soft earth around the blood site. But more significantly, we found the tree where the bark had been torn away. It was a western red cedar, and a large section of bark had been deliberately removed, torn off in a way that showed enormous strength. The wound on the tree was fresh, matching the timeline of Derek's incident. We took samples, photographs, measurements. The footprints matched the size and characteristics we'd documented in previous cases. The bark removal showed intelligence and purpose, an understanding that the bark could be used as a pressure dressing. We tracked the route the creature had taken while carrying Derek. The footprints were deeper, pressed harder into the earth from carrying the additional weight. We followed them for roughly 200 yards to where Derek's truck had been parked. Then the prints led away, back into the deep forest, disappearing into rocky terrain where they could no longer be tracked. Derek Thompson was offered the standard payment for his silence, $75,000, and an NDA. He refused. He said he didn't need the money and he wasn't going to lie about what happened. "The creature saved my life," he told Mr. Graves during a tense meeting. "I'm not going to repay that by pretending it didn't exist." That put the government in a difficult position. They couldn't arrest Derek like they had Danny Reeves back in 1963. Times had changed, but they also couldn't let him go public with his story. The compromise was elegant in its simplicity. Derek was allowed to tell his story to anyone who'd listen. No NDAs, no payments, no restrictions. But simultaneously, a careful disinformation campaign was launched. Articles appeared in tabloids, deliberately ridiculous and sensationalized, claiming Derek had been abducted by aliens or had encountered a demonic forest spirit. His story was grouped with obvious hoaxes and crazy claims. Legitimate journalists who might have taken him seriously were fed information suggesting Derek had a history of attention-seeking behavior, which wasn't true, but was impossible for him to disprove. Within 6 months, Derek Thompson's incredible story of being saved by a Sasquatch had been thoroughly discredited in the public eye. He appeared on a few daytime talk shows, where he was treated as a curiosity, almost a joke. The audience laughed when he described the creature applying first aid. His story became known as just another Bigfoot tale, lumped in with blurry photos and obvious frauds. Derek eventually stopped talking about it publicly. He knew the truth, and a small group of people believed him, but the larger world dismissed him as a confused man who'd hallucinated during a traumatic medical emergency. I visited Derek one last time in 1992, 5 years after the incident. His leg had healed well, though he walked with a slight limp. We sat on his back porch drinking coffee, looking out at the forest that stretched beyond his property. "Do you ever regret not taking the money?" I asked him. "Not for a second," he replied. "That creature didn't save me so I could profit from it or betray it. It saved me because it chose compassion over indifference. That's worth more than any amount of money." He looked at me with shrewd eyes. "You know they're real, don't you? You've seen the evidence." I gave him the only answer I could. "I know what I've documented in my work." Derek nodded. "Then you know we're doing the wrong thing. These creatures, they're not animals. They're people, and we're treating them like they don't exist, like they don't matter. One day that's going to come back to haunt us." He was right, of course, but I was trapped in the system, complicit in the cover-up, documenting truth that would never see the light of day. The fifth case occurred in November of 1993 in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, and it revealed just how far the government would go to maintain the secret. A research team from Duke University had been conducting a long-term ecological study in the Pisgah National Forest. 4 graduate students and their faculty advisor, Dr. Margaret Chen, no relation to me, had established a base camp for a 2-week data collection period. On November 8th, one of the graduate students, a young woman named Sarah Vance, was collecting soil samples about a mile from base camp when she saw something that made her freeze. A Sasquatch, a large female based on her later description, was digging in the earth with her hands, harvesting roots from the ground. Sarah had the presence of mind to activate her video camera, a professional-grade device the team was using to document their research. She filmed for approximately 3 minutes, getting clear footage of the creature digging, examining the roots, and eating them. The creature never noticed Sarah, who remained completely still behind a fallen log. Then the Sasquatch stood, gathered several of the roots, and walked away into the forest. Sarah had captured the clearest video footage of a Sasquatch that had ever been recorded. Professional quality, good lighting, steady camera work, showing the creature's face, body proportions, movements, everything. When she returned to camp and showed the footage to Dr. Chen and the other students, they were simultaneously excited and terrified. They knew what they had. They also knew it would change everything. Dr. Chen made the responsible decision. She contacted the National Park Service to report the sighting and offer the footage for scientific analysis. That call was intercepted by the monitoring systems our agency had in place. Within 4 hours, Mr. Graves and a team of 6 men arrived at the research camp by helicopter. The team wasn't there to congratulate the researchers on their discovery. They were there to confiscate the footage and ensure it never saw the light of day. I wasn't part of the initial response team, but I was called in 2 days later to help with what they called damage control. When I arrived at a facility outside Asheville where the research team was being held, I found 5 people who were angry, confused, and frightened. They'd been detained, not arrested, but not free to leave either, while the government decided how to handle the situation. Dr. Chen was particularly outraged. "You have no right to hold us," she told me during our first meeting. "We've done nothing wrong. We documented an unknown species, which is exactly what scientists are supposed to do. That footage belongs to the scientific community. It belongs to the world." "I understand your frustration," I said carefully, "but you've stumbled into a matter of national security that's far more complicated than you realize." "National security?" Sarah Vance interrupted. "It's a primate species living in our forests. How is that a threat to national security? Because if that footage becomes public," I explained, "these creatures will be hunted to extinction within a generation, because logging companies will sue to prevent habitat protection that would cost billions of dollars, because religious groups will debate whether they have souls, because people will flood into the forests looking for them, disrupting ecosystems and potentially leading to violent confrontations. The secret isn't about protecting the government. It's about protecting them." Dr. Chen wasn't buying it. "So your solution is to pretend they don't exist? To deprive science of the most significant zoological discovery in a century? To let these creatures remain unknown and unprotected by any legal framework?" "Yes," I said quietly, "because the alternative is worse." Over the next week, I spent hours with the research team, explaining the history of cover-ups, showing them some of the documentation we'd accumulated over 3 decades, helping them understand the scope of what they'd uncovered and why it had to remain secret. Some of them eventually came to understand our reasoning. Others never did. The video footage was destroyed. Sarah's camera was returned to her with the memory card replaced. The research team was offered a settlement, $200,000 each, to sign NDAs and agree never to discuss what they'd filmed. 4 of them signed. Dr. Chen refused. She argued, she threatened to go public, she contacted attorneys, but she'd already signed the NDA when she first accepted federal funding for her research. Buried in the paperwork was a clause about classified information and national security. She was bound by contracts she'd signed years earlier without understanding their implications. Eventually, Dr. Chen was given a choice: sign an additional NDA, accept the settlement, and continue her academic career, or refuse and face prosecution for violating federal security regulations. She signed, but she never forgave herself for it, and she never forgave me for being part of the system that forced her hand. I heard she left academia in 1997, moved to private sector work, and never spoke about her research in the Pisgah National Forest again. That case troubled me more than most because I saw myself in Dr. Chen's anger and disappointment. I'd joined this work 30 years earlier thinking I was protecting something important. Now I was destroying scientific evidence and silencing researchers who were trying to expand human knowledge. I was approaching 60 years old, and I was questioning everything about the choices I'd made. The 6th case came in July of 1998 in Alaska, and it remains the most disturbing incident I ever investigated. A hunting guide named Russell Kane was leading 2 clients, wealthy businessmen from Texas, on a brown bear hunt in the Wrangell St. Elias National Preserve. On July 19th, the 3 men tracked a large male brown bear to a remote valley. Russell's clients both fired at the bear from approximately 100 yards. At least one shot hit, wounding the bear but not killing it. The wounded bear fled into dense brush, and Russell made the decision to track it. Wounded bears are extremely dangerous, and leaving one to suffer or potentially encounter hikers was irresponsible. What they didn't know was that they were being watched. The men tracked the wounded bear for nearly 2 hours before finding it collapsed in a clearing, still alive but dying from its injuries. Russell's clients wanted trophy photos with their kill. As they approached the bear, something emerged from the tree line. 3 Sasquatch, 2 large males and what appeared to be a juvenile. They entered the clearing and positioned themselves between the hunters and the dying bear. The creatures made no aggressive moves, but their intent was clear. They were protecting the bear. Russell later told me he'd never been so terrified in his life. The 2 adult Sasquatch were massive, easily 8 feet tall, and they were clearly agitated. One of them made a loud vocalization, a warning sound. Russell's clients, pumped with adrenaline and testosterone, made a terrible decision. One of them raised his rifle and fired at the nearest Sasquatch. The shot missed, but it triggered a response that Russell described as nightmarish. The 2 adult Sasquatch charged. They moved with shocking speed, covering 50 yards in seconds. Russell and his clients ran, but one of the clients, a man named Brad Morrison, tripped and fell. The Sasquatch were on him instantly. Russell heard Brad screaming, heard sounds he couldn't identify, and then silence. He and the other client, a man named Eric Wong, kept running. They made it back to their base camp, gathered essential gear, and hiked through the night to reach their bush plane. They flew out at first light and contacted authorities. I arrived in Alaska 3 days later with a full investigative team. We flew into the valley where the incident occurred, heavily armed and moving with extreme caution. We found Brad Morrison's body in the clearing where he'd fallen. The cause of death was blunt force trauma, massive injuries consistent with being struck by something incredibly strong. The medical examiner estimated he'd been hit with a force equivalent to being struck by a car. But what disturbed me most was what we found near Brad's body. The brown bear they'd been hunting was gone. Not just dead and scavenged, but deliberately moved. We found drag marks leading to a location about 200 yards away where the bear had been buried. Not just covered with dirt, but properly buried with rocks placed over the grave site. The Sasquatch had protected the dying bear, defended it against humans who'd killed it, and then given it a burial. That suggested not just intelligence, but a value system. Beliefs about death and respect for life that transcended their own species. Russell Kane and Eric Wong were detained and debriefed. Their story was consistent and verifiable. They'd shot a bear, tracked it, been confronted by Sasquatch protecting the bear, and one of them had fired at the creatures, triggering a deadly response. Legally, they were guilty of nothing. They'd been on a legal hunt. They'd acted in what they perceived as self-defense when charged, and Brad Morrison's death could be classified as a wildlife attack. But the truth was more complex. They'd intruded into territory the Sasquatch considered theirs. They'd wounded an animal the creatures were trying to protect, and when fired upon, the Sasquatch had defended themselves with lethal force. This wasn't the peaceful human-helping behavior we'd documented in other cases. This was a demonstration that Sasquatch could be dangerous when threatened, that they had the capacity for violence when protecting something they valued. The government's response was swift and absolute. Brad Morrison's death was officially attributed to a brown bear attack. The wound patterns were consistent enough that the medical examiner's report could be written to support that conclusion. Russell Kane and Eric Wong were paid substantial sums to never discuss what really happened. The entire incident was classified and the site was declared off-limits for any future hunting or research. But internally, the case sparked intense debate. If Sasquatch could kill humans in defense of an animal, what else might they do? Were they a threat that needed to be more actively managed? Should we be trying to capture specimens for closer study? I argued vehemently against any escalation. The creatures had acted in self-defense, I said. Humans shot at them first. We can't blame them for protecting themselves. But others in the agency saw it differently. They viewed the Alaska incident as proof that Sasquatch were dangerous and unpredictable. Several proposals were floated for more aggressive monitoring, even for capture operations. Those proposals were eventually rejected, largely because the cost and risk were deemed too high, but they remained on the table as contingency plans. The Alaska case marked a turning point in my career. I was approaching retirement age. I'd been doing this work for 27 years, and I was exhausted from the cover-ups, from silencing witnesses, from destroying evidence. I'd spent 3 decades protecting a secret, and I wasn't sure anymore if we were doing the right thing. The 7th and final case I need to tell you about happened in October of 2003, just months before I retired. This one didn't involve a dramatic encounter or new evidence. Instead, it revealed just how much the government had been hiding, even from me. I was called to a facility in Virginia, a classified location where the agency kept its most sensitive materials. Mr. Graves had retired years earlier, and I was now one of the senior members of the team. I'd been summoned by his replacement, a woman who went only by Ms. Sterling. She led me through layers of security to a vault I'd never accessed before. Inside were filing cabinets containing decades of documentation, cases that had never been shared with the field investigators like me, cases that had been deemed too sensitive even for our eyes. Ms. Sterling opened one cabinet and pulled out a folder marked June 1963. Gifford Pinchot, the original case that had started the cover-up, the one Mr. Graves had told me about on my first day. I'd been told that the Sasquatch family had fled the cave and was never found. That wasn't entirely true, Ms. Sterling said quietly. She opened the folder and showed me photographs I'd never seen. Images of 2 adult Sasquatch and 1 juvenile in metal cages. The creatures looked terrified, pressing themselves against the backs of the cages, their eyes showing clear distress. They were captured, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. 3 days after the initial encounter, they were taken to a military facility in Nevada, studied for 18 months. Tissue samples, cognitive testing, attempts at communication, everything you'd expect from a first contact situation with an unknown intelligent species. What happened to them? I demanded. The juvenile died after 6 months. Failure to thrive in captivity. The 2 adults were kept for another year, but their health deteriorated. Both died within weeks of each other in December of 1964. Ms. Sterling pulled out more folders, more cases, a pattern of captures and studies spanning 4 decades. Not many, she assured me, maybe a dozen individuals over 40 years, but enough to conduct extensive research. The government had learned far more about Sasquatch than I'd ever been told. They'd mapped the genetic code, confirmed the close relationship to humans, documented language capabilities that suggested complex, abstract thought. They'd discovered that Sasquatch had cultural traditions, burial practices, even primitive art. And they'd kept all of it secret, even from the investigators who were risking their lives to document these creatures in the field. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked. "Because you're retiring in 3 months," Ms. Sterling said, "and because you deserve to know the full truth before you leave. Also because we need your recommendation." She pulled out one final folder, recent surveillance data from the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. We've been tracking a family group there for 2 years, 7 individuals, including 2 juveniles. They're living in an area that's scheduled for logging operations next spring. We need to decide whether to relocate them, which would require capture and transport, or to cancel the logging, which would require explanations we're not prepared to give. What would you do? I looked at the surveillance photos, images captured by hidden cameras showing Sasquatch going about their daily lives. A mother with her young, a male teaching a juvenile how to catch fish, a group gathered around what looked like a primitive campfire. These were people, I said finally, not animals, people with families and cultures and lives that matter just as much as ours. We need to stop treating them like a problem to be managed and start treating them like what they are, an indigenous people who have every right to exist in these forests. Ms. Sterling smiled sadly. I was hoping you'd say that. I've been making the same argument for years, but I'm not sure how much longer we can maintain this position. The world is changing, Mr. Chen. Satellite technology, trail cameras, DNA analysis, it's getting harder to keep secrets. Sooner or later, someone is going to get undeniable proof. Footage we can't confiscate, genetic evidence we can't suppress. When that happens, everything changes. She was right, of course. I retired in January of 2004, ending a 33-year career in the strangest job anyone could imagine. I'd investigated 67 cases, documented hundreds of encounters, and helped maintain a cover-up that spanned more than 4 decades. Now, in 2025, I'm 71 years old, and I'm telling you these stories because the secret is finally starting to unravel. Trail cameras are everywhere. Hikers carry phones with high-quality cameras. DNA analysis has become so advanced that samples can be processed quickly and cheaply. The government can't suppress everything anymore. More and more evidence is accumulating, becoming public, being taken seriously by mainstream scientists. The creatures I spent my career hiding are slowly being revealed to the world, not through official disclosure, but through the simple reality that secrets this big can't be kept forever. The 7 cases I've told you about represent just a fraction of what I witnessed, but they reveal the key truths about Sasquatch. They're real, they're intelligent, they're capable of compassion and violence, they have culture and beliefs, and they've been systematically hidden by a government that decided the public couldn't handle the truth. Were we right to keep the secret? I still don't know. Maybe we protected these creatures from extinction. Maybe we just delayed the inevitable. Maybe we denied humanity the chance to grow and adapt to a larger, stranger world than we imagined. What I do know is this. Somewhere in the forests of North America, in the deep places where few humans venture, there are people who aren't quite human. They've survived against incredible odds, adapting and hiding while the modern world encroached on their territory. They've watched us cut down their forests, fill their valleys with roads and towns, and they've chosen to retreat rather than fight. They've shown us compassion when we didn't deserve it, saved our lives, protected our children, and we've repaid them with lies and denial. The cover-up is ending whether the government wants it to or not, and when the truth finally comes out completely, when undeniable proof forces us to acknowledge what's been hidden for so long, we'll have to answer some hard questions. What do we owe these creatures? How do we make amends for decades of denial? Can humans and Sasquatch coexist, or have we already destroyed too much of their world for that to be possible? I don't have those answers, but I know we'll need to find them soon. The secrets I kept for 53 years are slipping through our fingers, and the world is about to discover that the legends were true all along.